Commander Aaron moved through the ruined city like a man who carried the map of every scar and every promise within his bones. He remembered when the towers still chimed with morning voices, and when children raced between stalls that smelled of spice and oil, how the streets were quiet with an ache that settled into the bones of everyone who remained. People walked with folded hands and eyes that watched the sky as if the heavens might still offer mercy. Aaron kept his hand on the worn grip of his rifle, though it rarely left his back because weapons were kept more for memory than use. But people liked to feel that memory against their skin. Nearby, a woman named Miri planted seedlings from a tin can, while humming a lullaby she had learned from her grandmother. Small green leaves trembling like a private rebellion against the ash that covered the rooftops. Children learned to make toys from scrap metal, and they laughed with the kind of sharp joy that cut through the day, and made adults look away so they would not spend their laughter into tears. The Imperium walked above in steel and silence, their ships like slow moons that did not notice graves and did not care for who tended them. Their rule had been measured in orders that never asked why and in quotas that never thought of hunger. Still, humans kept small rituals. Tea boiled over a candle flame. An old man told maps by memory to a boy who would carry them further than the old man could imagine. This was how survival had hardened into a soft stubbornness, and Aaron believed that stubbornness could be sharpened into something that would surprise the universe. His squad gathered in a hollow between two collapsed plazas, and their faces were lit by a single lamp that trembled like a small sun. Each face was a story. Jorah with her quick grin that could scavenge hope from the smallest trash. Cade, who learned engines from looking and not from manuals. Lena, who mended clothes and hearts with equal care. And Quiet Rel, who held the logbooks that kept their past safe. They joked in a way that pretended normalcy, and in their jokes lay the thin thread of courage that kept them warm. Aaron spoke, to them with a voice used to being heard by men who must decide life and loss in a breath. He told them of the signal that had come at midnight like a knock at the world's door, a single coded note that carried a human stamp and the scent of a fleet. The signal did not boast. It simply said, "We are coming home." The words were not loud when they left the transmitter, but they spread like a fever in the market and in the workshops. Mothers cupped their children and listened to the stars as if they could hear in them a step. The magistrate tried to keep order with proclamations that fell like paper rain. People read and then folded the papers into cranes or boats. They preferred hope to commands. Aaron felt the old anger rise, but he set it into work instead of letting it burn him. He ordered the squad to gather supplies and to check the old engines that gave their small ships breath. The town had 3 ships tucked beneath a rusting dome. They had no sails left, but they had hearts and cunning and men who knew how to hide heat and how to speak in silence. While they worked, word spread of small lights in orbit, and the rumors grew like wildfires. Some said it was a bluff, and that the Imperium would laugh and then punish them for dreaming. Others said it was the last hope, and they wrapped the rumor around their shoulders like a coat. Aaron walked the docks where a child sold crooked trinkets, and the child gave him a charm that had survived the burning. It was small and warm in his palm, and he placed it in the pocket over his heart as if to keep the promise safe. Evening came, and the sky was a bruised sheet where only the brightest stars dared to show. And then at the horizon something moved that did not belong to the usual patrols. A vessel cloaked in the way old stories cloaked heroes. It revealed itself. In a slow, careful breath, and the people watched as if remembering a dream. The ship carried no banners, and yet the sight of a human insignia burned into the minds of those who had waited. The hull was scarred, but it carried music in the way it cut the still. Pilots shouted. Old men laughed with tears that tasted of metal and salt. Women lifted their faces as if to drink the sound. Aaron stood with his hand on the rail and felt an odd calm press into him. This was the hour when choices were simple and terrible at once. The newcomers did not come armed with speeches. They came with precise gestures and faces lined by long journeys. They spoke of rally points and of safe corridors and of ships that would take the children away from the smoke. And when Aaron heard the plan, he felt a new map sketch itself across his chest. It was not a blueprint for glory, but for survival and for the fierce small things that made them human. The fleet was small, but it carried enough courage to tilt the scale of attention. News moved faster than words. Flags of human color sparked in the occupied towns, and like the first beats of a drum, they called the scattered to gather. Not all came at once, because fear is faithful to its post. But those who came brought skill and stories and a hunger that had not been satisfied by long years of silence. Somewhere a bell rang. Though no one could say which bell it was, it rang for the gardeners and for the engineers. It rang for the thieves who learned to give better than they took. It rang for mothers who made rooms for strangers because strangers were family before the Imperium named them otherwise. Aaron looked to the sky and to his small band, and he knew the first move had been made. The first move was not a battle, but a promise. A promise that when humans chose to stand, the world would tilt, and old machines would have to take account of the human habit of refusing to quit. As night swallowed the edges of the city, a new order of plans began, and every hand bent to its task with the raw, bright strength of people who had waited and were ready to act. The hour of return had come, and none could say yet how the future would be written. But in the hush that followed, Aaron felt the shape of a storm that would not be measured in days, but in hours. And he smiled without knowing if the smile was prayer or threat. The morning after the fleet appeared, the world was not the same. The air itself seemed alive with whispers and footsteps that had not been heard in years. Even the wind that brushed against the shattered domes carried something like memory. People who had long stopped believing in sunrise woke with fire in their eyes, and every broken tower looked suddenly like a weapon waiting to be reborn. Commander Aaron stood in the plaza, where the night before the ship's lights had painted the stone silver and blue. Now workers and old soldiers gathered around him, ready to turn rumor into action. They had salvaged engines from mining crawlers, melted alloys from the bones of wrecked patrol craft, and turned useless things into possibility. Miri, the woman who had once grown seedlings, now carried an arc torch that shone brighter than any candle. She laughed as she cut through iron with the ease of someone slicing bread. She said she was done planting roots. Now she was planting fire beside her. Jorah and Cade argued about fuel flow and angles, their words sharp but alive. They could fight like family because they believed the same thing, that humanity's hour was finally beating loud enough for the stars to hear. Aaron's radio crackled, and a deep voice came through. It was the captain of the new fleet, a man called Solon, whose name was already beginning to stretch into legend across the comm bands. Solon spoke without ceremony. He said, "We came back not to lead, but to fight beside you." And every ear in the plaza bent closer to hear his next words. "We have learned how the Imperium thinks, and we have built what they will never expect. But we cannot hold if the ground does not rise with us." Aaron answered with steady calm, telling Solon that the ground had never stopped breathing, and that the people here would rise higher than steel. Solon gave coordinates for a rendezvous at the edge of the mare belt, where the first strike would begin. And when the message ended, the air felt charged like a sky before lightning. The work became feverish. Everyone moved with new speed but also new purpose. No one asked what if they failed, because that question had been answered long ago when they chose to live under silence and decided it was not enough. The Imperium noticed the shift. Their sensors tracked the growing power signatures in the cities, and they sent drones to investigate. But the humans had learned stealth from the hunters of their old forests. They used smoke, thermal shields, and reflected dust, so the machines saw nothing but empty ruins. Cade built decoy beacons that mimicked energy bursts far away, drawing the patrols out of position, and every hour bought them another hour of preparation. Lena rewired comm towers to broadcast encrypted orders disguised as children's songs, so even if the Imperium listened, they would only hear the sound of laughter. It was a rebellion, disguised as innocence. At sunset, Aaron climbed the observation deck that once served as a tourist platform. He could see the curve of the planet where the oceans met the dark. He saw small bursts of engine light from hidden ports where more ships took to the void. He thought of the millions of humans spread across systems, some still enslaved, some forgotten, all waiting for one signal to know they were not alone. He sent a single coded pulse through the net. The word was simple: rise. The response came almost instantly across the bands, from mining colonies, from orbital stations, from farms buried beneath rock. One by one voices answered with the same word: rise. The Imperium commander stationed above the planet noticed the sudden surge and misread it as a transmission error. He would learn too late that it was the sound of a species waking from its long grief as night fell. The stars above flickered, and one by one the human ships decloaked in formation, their hulls blackened to hide from scanners, but lit by blue veins of heat that looked like living rivers. They were not large compared to the enemy's dreadnoughts, but they carried human minds behind every control, and that was their real weapon. Aaron boarded the transport with his squad. Jorah grinned and said, "It feels strange to fly again," Aaron answered. "It will feel stranger when we win." The transport shook as it climbed into the thin air, leaving behind the city that had been both prison and promise. Below them fires burned, but those fires were no longer signs of destruction. They were torches marking the path to freedom in orbit. The human fleet drifted like a quiet storm, gathering patience. Solon's flagship was a massive carrier named Dawnbreaker, built from fragments of lost ships welded together by desperate hands. When Aaron's transport docked the corridor, lights turned gold, welcoming old blood back into the veins of the fleet. Solon met him in the hangar, tall, broad, with lines of age across his face that looked carved by wind. He said, "You came faster than expected," and Aaron replied, "We have been waiting too long for this moment." Solon nodded and showed him the tactical map. The first target was an Imperial communications array orbiting the twin moons. If they took it, they would blind the entire sector. The plan was simple in shape but immense in risk. The array was defended by cruisers that outgunned every human vessel combined. Solon smiled grimly and said, "That is why we do not fight the way they do. Humans move like water. When you pour water on stone, it finds a crack and breaks it from within." Aaron looked around at the crews, some young, some scarred, all carrying that same human light. They called it madness. Once he thought, but now it is strategy. As the fleet moved toward the moons, the Imperium detected the approach too late. Their scanners caught dozens of false signals from Cade's decoys, and by the time they corrected it, the humans were already inside the perimeter. Fighters launched from Dawnbreaker, like sparks from a forge. They flew low and erratic, unpredictable, like birds chased by a storm. The enemy gunners could not lock targets. The first wave cut through the array's defense grid with improvised torpedoes made from mining charges. The explosion lit the dark with a brief dawn. Miri, watching from the gunnery deck, whispered that it looked like sunrise, and for a heartbeat, everyone forgot fear. Then the counterfire came heavy and merciless. A blast tore through one of the smaller corvettes, sending it spinning into debris. But the crew kept firing until their last breath, shouting coordinates to guide others. Aaron's ship dived into the debris field, using the wreckage as cover, and from that graveyard of metal they launched a final strike that severed the array's spine. The enemy fleet reeled, blind and chaotic. The Imperium commander screamed for retreat, but his words vanished in static. The battle ended as quickly as it had begun. In hours it was over, and silence returned, the kind of silence that comes not from loss but from awe. Humans had done what the galaxy thought impossible. They had struck first and won. Aaron stood on the deck, breathing the thin air of victory. Solon placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "This is only the beginning." And Aaron answered, "Then let it begin." The battle for the moons had ended with fire and silence, but the war was far from over. The Imperium was wounded, not destroyed, and a wounded beast is far more dangerous than a calm one. In the days that followed, humans across the systems whispered about the miracle that happened in a single night, and how the cold metal of the Imperium had finally bled against the will of flesh and bone. Commander Aaron and his squad returned to the Dawnbreaker with victory in their breath but exhaustion heavy in their limbs. They had won fast, yet the cost was sharp. Their corvette allies gone to dust, their names already turning into code words for courage in the fleet logs. Solon called a meeting in the war hall where the air hummed with energy and fear. Around the long table stood pilots, engineers, and leaders of worlds that had been silent too long. Solon's voice filled the chamber with the calm weight of a man who had seen both ends of history. He said, "We have proven that the Imperium can bleed, but we must prove they can fall. This strike was only a whisper. The real storm comes next." Aaron nodded, his mind already running through maps and trajectories they had crippled. The communication array. But the Imperium still had planetary bases that could summon reinforcements from the core worlds. If they repaired the link within a week, the advantage would die before it could bloom. Cade unrolled a projection on the table. Lines of light shaped into the figure of an enormous shipyard orbiting the gas giant Trion 9. It was there. The Imperium built its command cruisers and war drones. If they could take or destroy that yard, the enemy would lose the spine of its fleet. Solon said, "Taking it is impossible, but sabotaging it from within is not." Jorah leaned forward with the grin that meant danger was already halfway done. she said. I always liked impossible. It sounds like a challenge. Aaron selected his team without hesitation. Jorah, Cade, and Lena would go with him, and Miri insisted on joining, even though her skill was with the torch. Not the gun, Aaron agreed, because he knew courage could weld steel tighter than bolts. The plan was to slip through the outer patrol lines in a disguised freight hauler posing as a supply ship for the Imperium salvage fleet. The Dawnbreaker's engineers spent 2 sleepless nights painting enemy markings and programming the right transponder codes. By the 3rd night, the ship, known as Emberlight, was ready. Its hull old and scarred, but its heart all human fire. The journey to Tryon 9 took 3 days and 3 nights under the shadow of pursuit. Imperial patrols swept the lanes scanning for rebel ships, and each time they passed too close, the crew held their breath, counting the beats between heart and disaster. Miri spent those hours in the engine room whispering to the machines as if they were old friends. Cade sat beside her, adjusting power flow, until the hum of the reactor felt like a heartbeat in rhythm with theirs. Aaron watched from the bridge, thinking not of battle, but of the faces they fought for: the miners, the farmers, the children building towers of scrap and hope. He swore silently that if this mission failed, it would not be because they lacked will. The Emberlight reached Tryon 9's orbit beneath a curtain of storms that glowed orange and green from the gas giant below the shipyard. Floated above it, vast and skeletal, a city of cranes, lights, and shadows. 1,000 drones moved across its length, assembling cruisers that could destroy planets. Aaron's crew donned their stolen uniforms and transmitted docking codes. The automated control tower responded with mechanical indifference, authorizing entry. Their fake credentials had worked for now. The Emberlight drifted into one of the lower maintenance bays and locked into position as soon as the clamps held. Aaron ordered silent mode. They moved quickly, splitting into pairs. Cade and Miri went to plant charges near the reactor conduits, while Jorah and Lena handled the data cores to upload a virus that would scramble construction algorithms, leaving the yard in chaos. Aaron moved between them, keeping track through whispered comms. His steps quiet against the steel as he passed workers and drones, none of whom gave them more than a glance. Humans had always been good at blending in when pretending to obey. For hours, the operation unfolded like clockwork until Cade's voice cracked through the channel with a sharp warning. He said, "Commander, patrol inbound, not drones, humans, officers armed." The timing was too perfect. They had been discovered. The Imperium must have intercepted some trace from the Dawnbreaker, or perhaps someone within the fleet had betrayed them. Aaron ordered fallback positions immediately. The alarms began to scream. Red light drenched the bay, and the air filled with the sound of boots and charging weapons. Jorah fired first, her shot, clean and quick, dropping a guard before he could shout. Miri set off a decoy charge, shaking the floor with a blast that echoed like thunder. Cade dragged her behind a pillar as shrapnel rained down. Aaron covered their retreat, using a captured rifle and a steady aim, every move calculated with cold precision. But inside his chest, the old rage burned hot. The rage that came from years of watching his kind turned into numbers on Imperial reports. They ran through corridors that twisted like veins. The shipyard alive with sirens and drones rising from the ceilings. Lena completed the virus upload just before an explosion ripped through the command deck. The virus spread like wildfire, screens flashed, and machinery turned against its masters. Drones malfunctioned and crashed into bulkheads. The entire yard became a storm of confusion. Cade's charges reached the reactor lines, and the explosion tore through the heart of the station, a sun born too close to flesh. The Emberlight lurched, free from the docking clamps, as Aaron and the last of his team sprinted aboard. Jorah covered the ramp, her rifle glowing hot from fire. Miri collapsed into the pilot seat, bleeding from a cut on her arm, but smiling, like someone who had just seen the impossible become real. The engines roared to life, and the ship shot out into the chaos, leaving behind the wreck of the Imperium's pride. When the shockwave cleared, the yard was a ring of fire and debris circling the storm world below. Aaron stood on the bridge watching it fade. He whispered a promise to those who had fallen. "You are not gone. You are written into the fire we lit." Solan's voice came through the comm, broken by static. He said, "The Imperium fleet has gone silent. They have lost their command line. You did it." Aaron replied, "We did it, all of us." But his eyes were distant already, knowing the Imperium would not let this humiliation rest. They would come harder, faster, and smarter next time. Yet for now, Humanity had time, and in wartime was victory. He turned to his crew, each face streaked with smoke and sweat, and said, "This is how we fight. We are not the strongest or the oldest, but we are the storm they never planned." For outside the stars burned like witnesses to what humans had become, a force born from ruin, carrying in their veins the fire that would one day remake the galaxy. The wreckage of the Trion 9 shipyard still burned across the orbit of the storm, whirled a bright wound against the dark that told every watching system the Imperium was not invincible, and for the first time in generations humans dared to dream without whispering. Commander Aaron stood in the hangar of the Dawnbreaker while the engineers worked on the Emberlight, the ship that had returned broken, but victorious sparks rained down like golden rain as welders patched hulls and mechanics worked with hands blackened by soot and hope. Around them, laughter and grief mixed in the same air. Because every victory carried a price and every loss carried a lesson, Miri walked among the crew, her arm wrapped in bandages but her voice as steady as iron. She told stories to keep their hearts strong. Stories of how the old Earth had once been rebuilt from dust and ruin, how fire could forge both steel and people. Aaron watched her with quiet pride, for she had become something more than an engineer. She had become the spirit of the fleet, the proof that humanity's soul was not something that could be catalogued or broken. Captain Solon summoned the senior officers to the strategy chamber, where the walls shimmered with maps of the galaxy. The Imperium's red territories spread like veins of infection across the stars. Solon said, "They will come for us with everything. They have lost a shipyard, a fleet, and their pride. They cannot let this stand." Aaron answered, "Then let them come, because now they will face humans who remember who they are." Solon smiled with the weary expression of a man who had lived through too many victories that felt like preludes to disaster. He said, "We must give the galaxy more than a battle. We must give them a reason to believe that freedom is not a dream, but a direction." The Dawnbreaker was being repaired, but its laboratories had been untouched, and in those labs scientists and engineers worked on a new project. Something born from the stolen data recovered during the raid on the shipyard. It was a fragment of alien design, unlike anything humans had built before, a crystalline core that pulsed with energy as if alive. Lena led the research team studying it. She said, "This technology is not imperial. It predates them by centuries, maybe by millennia. It responds to thought, it feels intention." Aaron watched as the crystal glowed faintly under her hand, and he said, "Then it feels humanity, because we are the only ones reckless enough to speak to stone and expect it to answer for weeks." They studied the artifact, learning how it resonated with neural patterns, how it seemed to amplify energy without consuming it. Slowly they began to adapt it into a prototype weapon, not one built to destroy, but to reshape energy, to bend light and sound into shields and bursts that could confuse sensors and neutralize firepower without direct combat. It was defensive and yet powerful, a creation meant for protection rather than annihilation. Solon approved the plan to integrate it into the Dawnbreaker itself, turning the ship into something new, a symbol of what humans could become when they used knowledge instead of fear. But progress brought attention. The Imperium's spies and agents had infiltrated neutral systems, and soon word reached them that humanity had found something beyond their understanding. In response, the Imperium launched a retaliation strike, targeting one of the human refugee worlds called Cyrinth, a green moon known for its gardens and schools. The attack came without warning. Plasma fire fell from the clouds and cities vanished in moments. Aaron heard the reports too late, and when he arrived there was nothing left but ash and silence. He walked through the ruins where children's drawings still clung to the walls, and he swore that whatever they were building, it would not just protect, it would end the age of cruelty. His heart turned from sorrow into focus when he returned to the Dawnbreaker. The engineers could see it in his eyes, a calm rage that made men move faster. The prototype core was ready, and they named it the Forge Heart. It pulsed in the center of the ship like a living sun. The process of integrating it was dangerous. One mistake could have turned the entire vessel into a supernova. Miri and Cade worked side by side, connecting conduits, while Jorah coordinated the outer defenses to buy them. Time drones circled the perimeter, and the fleet stood ready for any surprise strike. Every hand in the ship trembled, not from fear, but from the awareness that they were shaping something that could change the course of the war when the final sequence began. The lights dimmed, and the Forge Heart awakened. A wave of radiant energy spread through the decks. Every metallic surface hummed, and every person aboard felt a strange warmth, as if the ship itself had drawn breath for the first time. The Dawnbreaker no longer felt like steel and wires. It felt alive as the systems synchronized. Lena monitored readings that defied physics. She said it is stable but not fully understood. The energy is self-correcting, adaptive, like it wants to survive. Solon looked at Aaron and said, "Then it is truly ours because survival is the oldest thing humanity knows outside the fleet's perimeter." Alarms triggered an approaching Imperial squadron. Closing fast, they must have tracked the energy surge. Aaron ordered the crew to battle stations. The Dawnbreaker's new systems were untested, but there was no time for hesitation. As enemy cruisers emerged from the void, their cannons blazing, the Forge Heart reacted instinctively without command. It cast a shimmering field around the fleet, absorbing the first volley and scattering the rest across the void. The humans watched in stunned silence as the impossible became real. The enemy fired. Again, harder, faster, desperate to break through, but the field bent and twisted, redirecting energy back toward them. Their own fire turned against them, tearing their ranks apart within minutes. The space around the Dawnbreaker was filled with drifting debris and the light of fading engines. The fleet had survived without losing a single ship. The humans stood in silence before erupting into cheers, the kind that come from a victory no one dared hope for. Solon raised his hand and said to his crew, "Remember this moment because it is proof that even the smallest ember can light a sun." Aaron looked at the Forge Heart through the observation glass and saw its pulse steady and strong. He felt a connection between it and every soul aboard. It was more than technology. It was a reflection of what humanity had become. Raw, resilient, unbreakable. That night in the quiet after battle, he stood alone on the deck watching the stars and thinking of the lives lost on Sirinth. He whispered to the void, "We have made something new, and we will use it not for vengeance but for ending this cycle once and for all." He did not know that far away the Imperium High Council had seen the same light through their deep sensors, and they were terrified because, for the first time since their rise, they did not understand what they faced, and nothing frightens an empire more than a human with hope. The dawn that followed the battle around the Dawnbreaker carried a silence that was not peace but anticipation. Every corridor of the ship throbbed with the hum of the Forge Heart, and every soldier, every engineer, every pilot felt that hum inside their chest like a second heartbeat. The news of what had happened spread faster than light through relay networks, and whispers from ship to ship. They said the humans had turned a dying ship into a miracle. They said the Imperium had fired until its weapons broke, and still the humans stood when the rumors reached the outer colonies. Men and women who had once hidden in mines and shadows raised old flags again, the symbol of a circle of fire, the mark of Earth that had once meant home and now meant defiance. Commander Aaron stood on the command bridge watching the transmissions roll, in his eyes dark with thought. Captain Solon stood beside him, his expression carved in quiet satisfaction. The captain said, "It has begun. The galaxy is watching us, some with hope, some with fear." Aaron replied, "Then let them watch and learn, because humanity fights best when it has nothing left to lose below the bridge." Miri worked in the engineering bay, tracing the flow of energy through the new systems. She had barely slept since the activation of the Forge Heart, her mind dancing between awe and caution. Lena joined, her holding data pads full of readings. She said, "This energy is changing our ship. It is integrating itself into every circuit, every function. It is like the Dawnbreaker is evolving." Miri smiled, tired but bright. She said, "Maybe it is learning from us. Maybe it is alive and it wants to fight for survival, just like we do." While they spoke across the stars, the Imperium reeled from confusion and shame. Their losses at Trion 9 and the Dawnbreaker had shaken the myth of their invincibility. Their governors argued, their admirals blamed each other, and in the heart of their capital, the High Warden demanded results. They decided to send their most powerful fleet, led by Admiral Kale, a man known for turning rebellion into extinction. His orders were simple: erase the humans completely. Aaron and Solon knew that Kyle would come, and they knew he would bring death in numbers. But they also knew that humans had something more dangerous than numbers. They had imagination. The next phase of the war began not with explosions, but with invention. Engineers worked day and night, using the Forge Heart's energy to create weapons that defied Imperial logic. They built shields that bent light to hide whole cities. They built engines that whispered instead of roared, so that fleets could vanish into the void and strike unseen. They built drones that carried not bombs but decoy signals, turning the battlefield into a maze of confusion, and in the process they began to understand the Forge Heart itself was not a weapon, but a teacher. Each pulse carried patterns that adapted to their intentions as if it were guiding them rather than serving them. Cade called it the heart of humanity and said it was alive with our will. Aaron believed it because he could feel it in his bones. Days passed, and the fleet grew stronger, their small victories turning into campaigns they liberated. Mining worlds freed prisoners and turned them into soldiers. The Imperium began to pull back from outer sectors, unable to match the speed and unpredictability of the humans. Every defeat left the enemy more frightened and more cruel, unoccupied. World's Imperial forces executed civilians to spread fear, but instead of breaking humanity, it united them more tightly. Every life taken became a reason to fight harder. The humans became the story of fire that would not die still within victory. There was fracture success breeds, pride and pride breeds division. Some leaders within the resistance began to argue that humanity should not stop at freedom, that they should conquer the Imperium itself and take revenge. Solon warned them that conquest would turn them into the thing they fought against, but not everyone listened. Small splinter fleets began to act without orders, striking at targets for glory rather than strategy. One of those fleets attacked a neutral station, killing hundreds of civilians and nearly shattering the fragile alliances humanity had built across alien species, who now watched uncertain of whether the humans were saviors or monsters. When Solon received the report, his face turned gray with grief. He called Aaron into his quarters and said, "If we lose our soul in victory, we will lose everything that makes us human." Aaron nodded and replied, "Then we must remind them what we fight for, not to rule, but to live free." It was then that a message came. From Admiral Kale himself, transmitted openly to every system. He said, "Humans, you are clever, you are bold, but you are children playing with fire. The Imperium is eternal. We will come for you, and when we do, there will be no sunrise left in your sky." The words echoed through every channel like thunder. But instead of fear, the message sparked fury across the fleets. Soldiers painted Kale's name on their ships as a promise of who they would defeat. The Dawnbreaker moved into position at the front of the vanguard, preparing for the largest assault. Yet the plan was dangerous: to strike at the heart of Kale's fleet before it reached the colonies to cut the serpent. Before it could strike, Aaron stood before his crew and spoke with the calm strength that made even fear listen. He said, "We are not gods and we are not ghosts, we are human. We bleed and break and burn. But when we rise, the world changes today. We fight not to destroy, but to defend every life that still believes in morning." His words filled the ship like flames, spreading from heart to heart. Miri tightened the reactor seals and whispered to the Forge, "Heart, give us strength, not for power, but for courage." The energy pulsed brighter in answer, as if it understood. As the fleets met in the shadow of a dying star, the void turned into a storm of light. The humans moved like water and fire together, striking from angles Kale's ships could not predict. The Forge Heart's field bent enemy fire back against them. Every explosion another echo of defiance, but Kale's fleet was vast and disciplined. His ships formed into rings of iron, closing around the humans. One by one, Aaron saw friendly ships vanish into fire. The Dawnbreaker itself shuddered under constant barrage. Alarms screamed and the lights flickered. Miri's voice shouted over comms, "The Forge Heart is holding, but we cannot push much longer." Aaron gritted his teeth and said, "We do not push. We endure because endurance is victory." The Forge Heart pulsed. Again, its light spilling through the hull, brighter than any weapon in that glow. Aaron felt something beyond understanding, a connection, not just to his crew, but to every human fighting across the stars. He heard their voices, their hearts beating in unison, and knew that even if the Dawnbreaker fell, humanity would not. Kale's fleet began to falter, not because their ships were weaker, but because they faced something no machine could calculate, a will that refused to surrender. By the time the star's light dimmed, the Imperium line broke and the survivors scattered into the dark. Aaron looked at the fading glow of the Forge Heart and whispered, This is not the end, but the beginning. The hourglass had turned, and humanity no longer fought for survival. They fought for destiny. The stars over the battlefield still glowed with the dying embers of the last great clash. The wreckage of Imperial dreadnoughts drifted through the silence like broken monuments to a fallen arrogance, and within that silence humanity drew its breath again. The victory at the dying star had spread across the galaxy, faster than any fleet. Every colony, every outpost, every hidden bunker, now knew that the Imperium could bleed, and that knowledge became the fire that burned away despair. Yet even as new fleets formed and new hope took shape, Commander Aaron felt the weight of something darker, for victories bought with sacrifice often hide the cost within their glory. In the command chamber of the Dawnbreaker, Captain Solon studied the tactical maps, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. Reports came in of human splinter groups ignoring command orders, striking worlds without reason, their leaders claiming vengeance in the name of Earth. Solon spoke, quietly but firmly, to Aaron, saying, "We are winning battles, but we are losing ourselves. If this continues, we will become what we once feared." Aaron replied, "Then we must remind them that strength without purpose is ruin. We will show them what humanity truly stands for, not conquest, not revenge, but survival with honor." Miri entered the chamber, her face lit by the pale blue glow of the forge heart. She said, "The heart is changing again. It is not just energy. It is responding to our minds, to our unity. When we are divided, its pulse weakens, but when we act together, it grows brighter, as if it feeds on our connection." Solon looked at the glowing core through the observation glass and said, "Then maybe it reflects what we are and what we could be, if we do not destroy ourselves before we understand it." As the Dawnbreaker moved through the void, gathering scattered fleets, Admiral Kale prepared his final assault. The Imperium had lost its pride, and with pride gone, only vengeance remained. Kale's plan was not to retake the colonies or to capture prisoners. It was annihilation, pure and simple. He gathered what remained of the Imperial Armada's nearly 500 ships under his personal command and forged them into a single spear meant to pierce the heart of human resistance. They called it the Purge Fleet, the last act of an empire cornered and desperate. Meanwhile, on the Dawnbreaker, Aaron stood before a council of fleet captains, their holograms flickering around him. He said, "The Imperium comes with everything they have left. If we survive this day, the galaxy will remember that humanity stood when no one else could. We will not hide. We will not run. We will fight as one." They listened in silence, and one by one, they pledged their ships to the stand. The human fleet formed above the newly rebuilt colony world of Solara, a place once burned by the Imperium and now reborn as the symbol of human unity. Kale's fleet arrived like a storm, blotting out the stars, and the battle began. The sky became a canvas of fury. Beams of light tore through the darkness, shields flared and shattered, missiles arced like falling comets. Ships collided and vanished in waves of fire. But unlike before, the humans fought with precision, not rage, their formations shifting like living organisms guided by the Forge Heart's resonance. Miri and Lena worked in the reactor core, synchronizing energy bursts to amplify shields across the fleet. It was as if the Dawnbreaker had become a heartbeat for all humanity, coordinating every move, every strike, every defense. Admiral Kale watched in disbelief as his perfect formations crumbled before tactics he could not predict. He ordered his ships forward, screaming into the comms that humanity was a disease to be purged, but even his fury could not break their rhythm. Still, the Imperium had numbers, and numbers began to tell one by one. Human ships fell, their signals blinking out into silence when the Dawnbreaker itself was struck by a massive plasma barrage. Its hull cracked open to the void. Alarms roared through every deck. Miri screamed into comms, "We are losing containment. The Forge Heart is destabilizing. If it ruptures, it will take us all with it." Aaron rushed to the command. Deck blood running down his temple, he shouted, "Reroute power through auxiliary channels. Keep the core stable, no matter the cost." Solon tried to answer, but another explosion threw him across the floor. Smoke filled the bridge, and sparks rained from broken panels. Through the chaos, Aaron could hear the voices of his crew calling out, and in their chaos he felt the pulse of the Forge Heart inside his mind. It was faint, but alive. He closed his eyes and whispered, "If you are truly alive, Then help. Us fight not as our weapon, but as one of us. The light within the core flared through the ship, bathing it in white. Radiance systems came back online, and for a heartbeat time seemed to stop. Every sensor went blind as the Forge Heart unleashed a silent pulse through space. The energy wave spread across the fleet, touching every human vessel. And within that light, the pilots and soldiers felt the same connection Aaron had felt before, their thoughts and instincts aligned without words. Their actions perfectly synchronized. Kale saw it and knew this was no ordinary power. It was will turned into force. It was unity made real. He ordered his ships to retreat, regroup, but the humans pressed on, not out of hatred but out of determination. The Forge Heart's energy wrapped around their ships like a living aura, turning each strike into precision, each defense into purpose. Kale's command ship became the final target. Aaron ordered full charge, and the Dawnbreaker surged forward, even as its hull crumbled under fire. The Forge Heart's glow brighter than any star in that moment. Aaron saw Kale's face appear on the comm. The Admiral's voice steady with grim admiration. He said, "You fight like gods, but you are still only human." Aaron answered, "Yes, and that is why we win." The Dawnbreaker rammed the enemy flagship. The impact, sending a blinding flare across the battlefield, and then silence followed. When the light faded, the Purge fleet was gone, shattered into fragments, scattered through the void. The Dawnbreaker drifted among them, its hull torn apart, its systems dying. Solon lay unconscious. Miri crawled through smoke, reaching for the console. She whispered, "We did it, but at what cost?" Aaron stood barely upright, his body broken but his spirit blazing. He looked at the dimming core and said, "You gave us more than power. You gave us a soul." The Forge Heart pulsed weakly as if in reply, then slowly dimmed to darkness across the galaxy. The transmission of victory spread. The Imperium was finished, their fleets destroyed, their leadership gone, and humanity free. But Aaron knew freedom would bring new challenges. They had won the war, yet the true test was what came after, when the Dawnbreaker fell into the orbit of Solara. The surviving ships gathered around like children guarding their parent. The voice of Miri carried through the comms. She said, "This is not the end. This is the beginning of what we were meant to become." And as the sun rose over Solara, the light touched the wreck of the Dawnbreaker, glinting off its broken hull, like a promise that humanity had finally forged its destiny, not from conquest but from unity that no empire could ever break. "You said, no, right? Part 7, and Part 7 will be minimum 800 words," ChatGPT said. The wreckage of the Dawnbreaker floated above Solara, like a monument made of scars and courage. The once mighty ship that had carried humanity through its darkest hours now drifted in silence, half buried in the soft glow of the planet's dawn. Yet that silence was not the silence of death. It was the silence that comes before rebirth. Across the surface below, new cities were rising from the ashes of war. Men and women, once bound by chains, now stood free. Their eyes turned skyward, watching the remnants of the ship that had become legend. They called it the Last Vanguard, and its name spread through every colony, every outpost, every surviving fleet. The war was over. The Imperium shattered their fleets, scattered their rulers, gone, and for the first time in centuries, the galaxy belonged to no empire. But even in peace, the wounds of war ran deep. Commander Aaron had survived the final battle, though his body bore more metal than flesh. His left arm, a construct powered by the Forge Heart's remaining energy. He walked through the halls of the Dawnbreaker, now being turned into a memorial. His steps slow, his thoughts heavy. Beside him walked Miri, who still carried the faint glow of the Forge Heart within her. She had saved its last fragment, and now it pulsed in a containment sphere like a small sun. She said, "It is still alive." Aaron nodded and replied, "Maybe it is waiting for what comes next, because humanity will always need a heart that burns." The Council of Free Worlds met on Solara, under a sky still streaked with the contrails of battleships. They gathered to decide what the future would be. Representatives from the old colonies, the Outer Rim, the engineers, the soldiers, even alien allies who had fought beside humanity. All came together in one hall built from the hull plates of the Dawnbreaker. Aaron stood before them, not as a commander but as a voice among equals. He said, "We fought because we were hunted, and we survived because we stood as one. Now we must decide what kind of people we will be. Will we become conquerors in turn, or builders of peace?" The room was silent until Captain Solon, who had recovered from his wound, stepped forward and said, "The galaxy fears us now. They have seen what we can do. But if we use fear to rule, we will lose what made us human, and that will be the true defeat." His words were heavy but honest, and the hall slowly filled with nods. They agreed that humanity would not form an empire, but a coalition, a web of free worlds united by shared defense and exploration, the first true alliance of equals, and they named it the Concord of Solara. While politicians spoke of peace, the soldiers found it harder to rest. Many who had lost everything drifted between worlds, unable to find meaning in quiet skies. Cade, one of the youngest pilots from the Dawnbreaker, spent his days staring at the wreckage from an observation deck. He told Miri one evening, "I keep expecting another alarm, another battle, something to fight. Because when the fighting stops, I don't know who I am anymore." Miri placed the containment sphere beside him and said, "Maybe that's what this is for, to remind us that the fight was never just about killing. It was about finding something worth living for again." He looked at the glowing sphere, and for the first time, smiled. Weeks turned into months. The galaxy began to heal old trade routes. Reopened stations once used for war became centers of learning and exploration. Humans began reaching out to other species, not as conquerors, but as equals, sharing technology, knowledge, and culture. The story of the Dawnbreaker spread far and wide, told in songs, poems, and holograms. Children on distant worlds played with models of the ship, pretending to be the crew who had saved them from the darkness. The legend grew until some began to whisper that the Forge Heart was not just human creation, but a gift from the universe itself, a reflection of what humanity could become when united not by power, but by purpose. Yet peace never lasts without vigilance. One night, as Aaron walked through the memorial deck, the lights flickered and the faint pulse of the Forge Heart fragment began to quicken. He frowned and placed his hand against the containment sphere. A vision flooded his mind. Stars burning, then vanishing lines of code and energy, spiraling like living thought. It was not warning him. It was showing him something beyond the galaxy, something waking far away, something vast and ancient. The Forge Heart's pulse dimmed again, and Aaron whispered, "What did you see out there, Miri?" Arrived moments later, her eyes wide with worry. She had felt it too through the neural link she shared with the core. She said, "Whatever is coming, it is not the Imperium. It is something older, something that remembers before." Even they ruled. Aaron stood silent for a moment, then said, "Then humanity will remember who they are too, and we will be ready." The next day, he addressed the Concord from the Great Hall. He spoke not of fear, but of preparation. He said, "Peace is not the end of our journey. It is the beginning. We stand on the edge of something greater. The stars are vast and full of mysteries, some beautiful, some deadly. But we have learned the greatest truth of all, that the measure of humanity is not in what we destroy, but in what we endure and what we build together." Every world in the hall echoed with his words. Their leaders swore that whatever came next, they would face it. United, the meeting ended with a moment of silence for the fallen and a promise that the Dawnbreaker would never be forgotten. Years later, on the anniversary of the final battle, Miri visited the ship's resting place. It had been turned into a floating city called Haven Break. Its towers and domes grown around the ship's skeleton like new life. Sprouting from an ancient seed, the Forge Heart's last fragment powered the city's core, its light steady and calm. She walked through the halls, remembering every name, every sacrifice. When she reached the old bridge, she found a small group of children listening to an elder tell stories about the ship, how it had flown through fire, how it had faced the impossible, and won. One of the children asked, "Is it true that the Dawnbreaker talked to its crew?" And the elder smiled and said, "Maybe. Not with words, but with faith, because sometimes the universe speaks to those who dare to listen." Miri looked out the viewport at the endless sea of stars and whispered to herself, "We listened, and we answered." And somewhere deep within the Forge Heart's core, the light pulsed once more, as if in agreement. Far beyond Haven Break, beyond the edge of known space, a faint ripple moved through the void, a sign that something else had indeed awakened. But it did not come with malice, only curiosity, and in that moment the galaxy turned quietly toward a new chapter. Humanity, no longer just survivors, no longer just warriors, but explorers standing together. as the last vanguard of a new dawn, a species reborn from ashes now ready to write its destiny, among the stars with courage carved from the fire of their past and hope blazing brighter than any empire ever could. The light of the twin suns washed over Haven Break, turning the silver towers and the great skeleton of the Dawnbreaker into a sea of gold and amber. The air shimmered with warmth, and the sound of engines hummed faintly from the sky where fleets of new exploration vessels waited to depart. This was the day the galaxy would remember, not for war, not for victory, but for the birth of something new. Humanity had rebuilt from ruin, had risen from the dust of shattered worlds, and had become more than any empire had ever imagined. Commander Aaron, now older, his hair silver and his movements slow, stood on the highest balcony overlooking the dawn. His eyes traced the horizon where sky met space, and he felt the familiar quiet within his chest. The quiet that had once been filled with battle, now replaced by peace that still carried the echo of every sacrifice. Beside him, Miri stood holding the containment sphere of the Forge Heart, its light gentle like the breath of life. She said, "It is calmer now, like it is resting." Aaron smiled softly and said, "Maybe it knows that its purpose is complete because we finally learned what it tried to show us." Below them, crowds gathered from across the worlds of the conquered children, from colonies that had once been names on evacuation lists, now laughing under open skies, veterans in weathered uniforms standing side by side with farmers, miners, and builders. The air was alive with the hum of humanity, not as conquerors or soldiers, but as dreamers. They had come to witness the ceremonial awakening of the Dawn Voyager, the first ship built with the knowledge left behind by the Forge Heart, a vessel meant not for war but for exploration. Its hull shimmered like liquid silver, its engines woven from light and memory. Miri looked at it and whispered, "It carries the last gift of the Forge Heart, a piece of its living code." Aaron nodded and said, "Then it carries all of us because we are part of that code too. Every name, every dream, every breath." As the ceremony began, the voice of Captain Solon echoed through the central plaza, his tone strong and proud. He said, "Today we do not launch a weapon. We launch a promise. This ship will go beyond the stars, beyond every boundary ever drawn. And where it goes, humanity will follow, not to conquer, but to understand, and in that understanding, to live free." Every voice in the crowd rose as one in response, a sound like thunder, like the beating of a single heart. And the Dawn Voyager lifted slowly from the launch platform, rising through the golden haze, leaving trails of light behind like ribbons of memory. The Forge Heart fragment in Miri's hands began to pulse in rhythm with the ship's ascent, brighter and brighter, until its glow filled the entire plaza, and for an instant everyone could feel it. The same pulse that had guided them through war, now guiding them into peace. Aaron closed his eyes and remembered every face that had walked this path with him. Cade, the pilot who had learned to smile again. Lena, the scientist who had turned knowledge into hope. Solon, his brother in battle, and Miri, who had carried the light when all else failed. He whispered, "You are all still here because we never truly lose those who became part of what we are." The light touched his face, and he could almost hear the voices of the lost carried on the wind, of stars whispering words, not of farewell but of continuation. When the light faded, the Dawn Voyager vanished into the horizon, leaving only its trail glowing faintly in the sky. Miri placed the now dormant sphere into a crystalline cradle at the center of the plaza and said, "This is where it will rest until we need it again. If the stars ever darken, it will wake and remind us of who we are." Aaron placed his hand over the cradle and said, "Then may that day never come. But if it does, humanity will be ready. Because this time we know our strength lies not in fire but in unity." As evening came and the sun sank below the horizon, the people of Haven Break gathered in the glow of thousands of lanterns released into the sky, each one carrying a name of someone who had fallen in the wars together. They rose higher and higher, joining the stars above until the heavens looked as if they were filled with souls shining down upon their children. Aaron watched until the last light disappeared, and then turned to Miri, saying, "We were once the lost, now we are the guides." She smiled through tears and answered, "Then let us guide well, for the universe is listening." Night deepened and the stars burned bright above the city. In the distance, the Dawnbreaker's remains gleamed like an ancient guardian standing watch over the New World wind. whispered through the steel, and the soft hum of the forge heart's last echo drifted across the fields of Solara. And through that sound one could almost hear the promise of a future without chains, without fear, and without end. The story of humanity written not in war, but in will carried forever by those who dared to rise when all others had fallen. And as the stars turned over, Haven break. The light of the forge heart pulsed one final time before fading into peace, a beacon eternal. A reminder that even the smallest spark of defiance can become a sun that lights the path for generations to come, the end.